And I guess I found myself about 2 years ago, I kept reading people who I really respect, like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, George Monbiot, people like that, who were saying climate change is a failure of the imagination.
Mm.
And I got under my skin. What do you mean? Climate change is a failure of, and I'd be sitting there, what do you mean? By which time they'd be off talking about something else. I was still there going, that was really interesting, that failure, what failure of the imagination bit, what do you mean? And it got me thinking. I read then some research that was published in 2010 by a woman called Kyung-hee Kim, a researcher at a university in the US, where she looked at a thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking, the kind of gold standard creativity test. Big data sets of this, 20, 30,000 people a year, going back to the early 1960s. Her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-1990s, at which point IQ kept rising and imagination started to decline. And when this was published, it was a big story in the US. It made the front page of Newsweek magazine. People said, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? And what does this mean for Hollywood? And neither of which I'm really that bothered about. But I never heard anyone in the climate change, social justice movement say, what does this mean for us? Because fundamentally, if people are losing the capacity to imagine anything other than what's in front of us, we really have a problem. And John Dewey, the educationalist, used to define imagination as the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise.
Mm.
And God knows we need the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise, because actually the business as usual and the way things are at the moment is basically a kind of a collective suicide pact, really. And so we have to, as Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. The time for kind of little incremental steps kind of changes was sometime maybe in the mid-80s, I guess. It's long since passed us by. So I came to think that, you know, we recognize as a society that if we don't have a good enough diet, we will see a rise of preventable illnesses. If we don't have a good education system, then collectively we will fail to reach up to our full potential. But just over here, just sort of out of our field of vision, our imagination is just sort of contracting and shrinking because we are creating the perfect storm for it to shrink of factors. So that researcher who I mentioned, she put that decline down to the decline in play. She put it down to the rise of screens in our lives, and she put it down to the rise of testing in education. I would add to that that we spend less and less time in nature. We are seeing a rise. We are creating the perfect conditions. In fact, we have an economic system which is designed to create anxiety and trauma and isolation and stress. And what those do is they affect the very part of the brain, the hippocampus, where the imagination fires from.